So in the last lecture, you learned how to create a mock function and test the interaction of one object with another. So we used this Boolean flag to determine if mail.send method was called. In this lecture, I'm going to show you a better approach to achieve the same thing. So in Jest, we have a method for creating mock functions. Jest.fn, which is short for function. So what we get here is a mock function. Mock function. This is like a function that we can call like this. But this function has no implementation. In other words, it's a function with no code. Now we can program this mock to return a specific value. For example, we can call mock function that mock return value, let's say 1. Now when we call this mock function, we get 1 as the result. So here, result would be 1. Now we can also program this mock function to return a promise. So instead of calling mock return value, we call mock function that mock resolved value. So with this, when we call this function, we get a promise. When we await that, we will get 1. If we want to simulate an error, instead of calling mock resolved value, we're going to call mock rejected value. So mock function dot mock rejected value. And here we pass an error object with some message. Now, with this, when we call mock function, this promise will be rejected. So technically this code should be in a try catch block. And in our catch block, we'll get this error that we pass here. So we can see with Jest, you can easily create a mock function and program it to behave a certain way. In each test, you can have a mock function that behaves differently. Now, why does this matter? Well, with this, we can simplify the implementation of this test. So instead of manually creating these functions and using these flags to determine if a method was called, we can use Jest to create a mock function. So let me show you how you can rewrite this test and make it simpler using a Jest mock function. So I'm going to delete all this. You're going to see it again. So we want to replace the real implementation of getCustomerSync with a fake or mock function. So let's see how we can rewrite these 3 lines. We set db.getCustomerSync to jest.function. This returns a mock function, and we can program it. We can call mock return value. And here we pass this customer object that we want to return. So this object should have an email property. So this line is exactly equivalent to these 3 lines. So let's delete this. Now similarly, we can replace mail.send with a fake implementation. Again, I'm going to rewrite it on the top. So mail.send, we set it to jest.function. Now here, we don't need to explicitly use this flag to determine if this function or this method more accurately is called. So we can delete all these lines. Here, change our expectation. So we expect mail.send. Here we have a matcher to work with mock functions. That is to have been called. So because mail.send is a Jest mock function, we can use this matcher on that. In contrast, when we create mock functions manually, we don't have this matcher. That's why we had to use a flag to determine if this function or this method was called or not. Obviously, you can see this code is far cleaner than what we had earlier. Now, in terms of organizing this, I would rather to have all my mocks in one place, have a line break, and then call the method under test, have a line break, and then make an assertion. Save. Back in the terminal, you can see all our tests are passing. Beautiful. So with this matcher, we can tell if a method is called or not. Now, sometimes you also want to check the arguments that are passed to that method. So we have another matcher to have been called with. And here you can pass all the arguments. In this case, when we call mail.send, look, when we call this method, we pass the email of the customer and this message. So back in our test, we can assert that this method is called with the email, which is in this case A, and that message. But as I told you before, when testing strings, we shouldn't check for the exact equality. So this approach works well when the arguments you pass to a method are not strings, like numbers, booleans, and so on. So if you still want to check the arguments that are passed to that method, you need to use a different approach. So let's go back to the first matcher. Now we can make an assertion about each argument passed to this method. So one more time, expect mail.send. This mock function has a property called mock. Here we have another property, calls, which keeps track of all the calls to this mock function. This is an array, so we access the first element, that is the first call to this function. Now this returns an array of arguments, so we can access the first argument and then assert that this argument equals to A. Now similarly, we can check the second argument, and here instead of using an exact equality check, we can use a regular expression. So we call to match, pass a regular expression, order. So as long as we have order in the message, we're happy. Save, back in the terminal, you can see all tests are passing. So this is another reason for using Jest mock functions as opposed to manually creating mock functions. With Jest mock functions, we can easily tell if they have been called, and we can also check all the arguments passed to these functions.